Welcome into the Field Vision Football Podcast. I'm Felix Johnson, joined by Head of Football Operations, Cody Alexander. Cody, how you doing this morning?
Doing great, man.
Doing awesome. We're joined by Max Toscano, who covers the Cincinnati Bengals for Sports Illustrated, along with covering tight ends very specifically. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. Max, how we doing?
I'm doing great, guys. Ready to talk some ball.
Awesome. So obviously you cover the Bengals. Two big deals coming down. T. Higgins gets 4 years. Also, Jamar Chase getting 4 years, but he's the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL now. Two huge deals. We were talking a little bit before we came on air, and I think you were saying something about the value of those contracts coming through as opposed to just the actual dollar amount. But talk a little bit more about that point you were making.
Whenever these big deals get handed out, I think the first instinct of a lot of people is to think about the negatives and the trade-offs of with the amount of the pie that they're taking up, that proverbial pie everyone talks about. But to me, when teams end up in salary cap trouble, it's when they overpay for less value. And I don't think that that's the case for the Bengals, right? I think that the Bengals are getting exactly what they paid for with Chase and Higgins. And I think that, you're going to divvy up the pie with a certain number of these high value contracts regardless. And I think that in a theoretical world, you would like to spread it out a little bit more evenly across your roster. But when you look at the force multiplier that the Burrow, Chase, and Higgins trio is ultimately, I think that the baseline that gives you as an offense, I think that as long as they're getting the value out of these guys, that the contracts the contracts reflect. I think they will. They're incredible players and they're young. There's you're not necessarily losing serve here, and I think when you lose serve on your value is when you start to end up in salary cap problems because you still have to then go pay more to make up that loss in value on your roster, and that's when you start to really get out of control with a lot of different high value contracts. So I think it's controlled. I think Higgins is frankly slightly undervalued. I thought he was going to get more than 30. He didn't. And I think it's fine. I don't think it really puts the Bengals in trouble. I think they have to draft and develop well. I think they have to do that anyway. I'd rather them do this than screw up a draft pick and then have to go overpay for your B- level receiver that is the only type that hits the market really.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a kind of misconception outside of these organizations and outside of that NFL bubble of like just the commonality of, hey, we know the commodity that we're getting. And then we're going to pay for it so that we don't end up having to bring in a high price free agency. I mean, that's kind of the misnomer about free agency, and the Bengals kind of set on their hands with this, which obviously they have these two big contracts that they were trying to get done. They didn't really bring anybody in. They kept the guys that they had because they're known commodities. And I think to your point is that in that sense, they don't feel like they're overpaying and they don't feel like they're putting themselves in kind of this cap hell because now we have these two high-priced receivers. There's other needs that we need. But if you go and you really look at the roster, it's a lot of homegrown talent. It's a lot of talent that they had already brought in from previous free agencies. They need to clean up the defense. But, to your point, you got to keep the quarterback happy. And if you have two guys, which are essentially dominant outside number one receivers in their own right, you kind of got to pay for them. I do think, again, Higgins essentially getting the Waddle deal was kind of that to me made it kind of the cherry on top of that. They didn't have to go out and shell out two $30+ million contracts.
Yeah, I think that's huge, especially for in the AFC as things currently stand. They're the only team that is in their most current structure that has beat Kansas City. And so I think bringing those two guys back that have torn Kansas City apart, and obviously the defense has gotten better since they've beaten them, and it's been a while since that's happened, but it's a real thing that is in their heads that we can go into Kansas City and beat the team that's made it to the Super Bowl 3 times in a row.
Right. And I think as far as defense goes, I think defense, and Coach, you know this better than anybody, I think defense more than offense is where you can, using proper identification of system fits, proper, coalescing of the pieces, you can make a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Like, I think if you're going to pick a side of the ball to play Moneyball on, I think it's defense, because I think if you get the right, I mean, Belichick's done this for years, right? Like, you talk about the quote unquote Belichick guys, and I understand that that's such a high bar to clear. But if you're going to have a consistently good defense in the NFL anyway, you got to be doing this stuff. And I think that that's how the Chiefs have been able to stay good even as their offense is hemorrhaged. And I think that the Chiefs, frankly, I think overall the Chiefs were worse off for not keeping Tyreek Hill. I think, part of that is that they thought they could draft and develop receivers behind him. But what they've actually been able to draft and develop is guys like Trent McDuffie, is guys like Nick Bolton, is guys like Leo Chanel, is guys like Mike Pennell, George Karlaftis, these rotational pieces that they can put together with Spagnuolo to create at least a competent unit that's just really been good in the last couple of years. But even when they were Super Bowls with Tyreek and Kelsey in 2019, the defense was competent and played up in the playoffs because you can get into these individual game plan scenarios. That's how the Bengals got stable. That defense was not absurdly talented. So I think it's a little crazy to suggest that the Bengals can't feel the defense as talented as the one as they had in 2021. Even if they did do that with a lot of free agency, because they're paying T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, they have to do the things that they have to do in the draft regardless. Because the Chiefs haven't done it in the draft on offense, and it's really become a problem. Mahomes has papered over a lot, but they're an offense that's hovering around the fringe of the top 10 with one of the greatest quarterbacks we've ever seen. Their receiver issues have become a huge problem with Kelsey getting older. Their whiffing on tackles has become a big problem. It's not like not paying Tyreek Hill has saved them from being able to fill out the rest of the roster. It just it is what it is. I think that they're if I had to pick a side of the ball that I had to piece together in the draft and in development cycle, it's defense.
Yeah, that's the weird part about Kansas City, is that they've figured out their defense through the draft, and they're trying to figure out their offense through the draft. It's just like they're like, all right, we have the quarterback and some offensive line pieces, and they're like, figure out the rest of it, and they've been very successful at it. But you talked about a lot about Steve Spagnuolo there, and Cincinnati's version of Steve Spagnuolo just got fired. Lou Anarumo, I guess their version Italian defensive coordinator, but Lou Anarumo, he's now the Colts defensive coordinator. How did that firing hit you, at least early on, and now as we've kind of moved on? And is it? I think Al Golden got that job, didn't he?
Al Golden.
And so how does that? What's the transition like going from Anarumo to Golden, and what improvements are you expecting there?
Well, I think there's a certain. I think it improves the thing that really hit the Bengals and became a problem over the last couple of years, and that's Anarumo is arguably one of the greatest game plan chameleons in the NFL as far as going from week to week and doing different things. Like, you look at the quote unquote prime Bengals for the last couple of years when they were doing great stuff on defense. You'd get a whole game where they'd zero blitz a ton. You'd get a bunch of different pressure paths and specialized pressure coverages, and then the next week they'd come out and they'd be able to live in like a zone quarters world and play a little bit more like D'Amico Ryans and Robert Saleh on the back end, and so that really helped when the roster was older and a little bit more developed and seasoned from free agency. But when it came time to replace those guys, I think they ran into the issue that they didn't necessarily have a system. And I think when you develop guys defensively, the times you see success are really when you are developing guys to a system, because you know exactly what roles you need, you know how to shield these things together into a broader whole. And I think that that's the issue the Bengals found, is that they weren't necessarily scouting types. They were just getting guys and trying to develop them into this whole collective, because defense really is the ultimate collective in football. And I don't think that they knew exactly what the kind of pieces they were looking for were. I think they knew up front, but I think that generally in the back end, I think it was a little strange and inconsistent. You see this with Daxton Hill. They haven't really known where to play him. They moved him to outside corner now, starting last year. And their other corner that they drafted in the second round tiny 5'10". So it's like you got these very different body types between Hill and DJ Turner, even though they both played at Michigan. But Hill played the star at Michigan. It's just a little weird. And so I think with Golden, you get an identity, and that's going to be a guy who's going to play a lot of cover one, who's going to be an even spacing base, he's gonna ask those ends to reduce inside a fair bit against condensed sets, who's going to ask those corners to live on islands and press. And so then you can whittle down your drafting, right? You can look at guys like Trey Amos, who are longer and have experience in playing man coverage. Benjamin Morrison obviously would be a good fit because he played in the system. Xavier Watts for the same reason. Siobhan Ravel is long and athletic. And so you can start to actually whittle down what types you need and then build this collective, which makes drafting so much easier, and it makes development easier because you go in with a plan and an idea.
Yeah, and I think the switch to cover one makes sense. I think the one thing that you've got a young secondary. I mean, most of these guys were drafted either 2022 or closer. Geno Stone, the one thing that he's a coverage safety. He's pretty good in coverage. He can play there. You got Jordan Battle, who is going to have to he's young. So again, you have all these young guys. What's an easy way to play them? Well, you play man coverage, right? Because I got that guy. And that's the one thing that I think if you look at this secondary, he tried to do it last year, play more man coverage. And I think, to me, it makes sense. You already have a 4 down front that's established. You probably need to find some more pieces inside. But you've got a young secondary. Let's make it easy on them. Let's play some cover one. And you can kind of use that hybrid 3-4, 4-3 structure that Golden was using at Notre Dame, I think, to kind of plug and play. So, I think it's a good move.
Yeah, I think that's better for Hendrickson as well, to be a guy who's actually standing up instead of actually, in the weeds there in the interior of the formation when it gets condensed. Like he is, I think, he can get his hand in the dirt. He definitely has a 4 down body, but he's not, to me, a guy who is built to play like true D end. I really do think he's more of a jack, which I think fits. Because they're going to play generally a 4 down spacing with, like you said, like with that hybrid front. And I think that they can also oscillate between even and odd a little bit. They did at Notre Dame, and they have TJ Slayton to play nose for that, which is nice now. But I agree on the back end that was a big issue when they lost Bates and Bell. It was communication, and this is a super complicated, super specific system. Not Sabanese in terms of actual structure and terminology or anything, but very Saban-y in the sense that they're going to go into the week with specific checks for everything, and you're going to have an incredible amount of communication. And these young guys really struggle with it because they were trying to plug Daxton Hill in there right away, and they signed Nick Scott, who was like the second safety in LA. He wasn't really handling any of the communication or anything, and so they just didn't have the, if you look at a Saban defense, they always have these guys, right? You have your Brian Branch, your Minka Fitzpatrick, your back end quarterback, and they really didn't have that when they lost Bell. And with Bates, they lost a guy who can really execute this stuff athletically, who can do all of the different things, who can come down and play in the box, who can run the alley on screens and perimeter fits, who can buzz down and take 3 up and carry them when they're speed at 3. You could do all, play deep half, play the post, all this stuff. So you can live in these different worlds because you have a guy who can go and be multiple different types of safety in one, and they just didn't have that since. And so I think now you whittle it down to an identity and you can draft. And I think that they're going to need another man corner, or they're going to have to develop. Cam Taylor-Britt's he's got the right body for it. I think there are a little bit of athleticism questions, but he's physical and he's long. So we'll see what they can do with him. And Dax Hill's long too. So in theory, they have the right bodies, but I think they can use an injection. But overall, the simplicity is going to be really good for them.
All right. Max, you also remember the tight ends, excuse me, which I've always found the tight end position interesting. I can't remember who I heard saying this, but it's the most difficult position to play because they're expected to block like a tackle, but also run routes and catch like a receiver. And that's kind of losing its definition over the last couple of years. I mean, I'm a Chiefs fan, so it's been a conversation with Travis Kelce his entire career. I remember it with Jimmy Graham, whether or not he was going to get paid as a wide receiver or tight end. Now this year you see it with Colston Loveland, where you see people saying, no, that guy is a wide receiver. They're very clear and distinct about it, but he's listed as a tight end. And so obviously we know this conversation through and through. It's more about alignment. And so where do you see that conversation going, like when it comes to like the Jimmy Graham part of it, where it's like, will tight ends start getting paid more like wide receivers? Will they be started treated more like receivers in offenses like you have seen with Travis Kelce, and being more focal points like in offenses like we've seen with Brock Bowers in his rookie year too?
Yeah, I think that I think that the tough thing about guys like Kelsey, Graham, and Bowers is that they are so freaky and unusual that like they are able to play receiver, and it's an extreme outlier for tight end bodies to actually play true wide receiver, which is why when teams draft guys in the first round at tight end and are looking for these wide receiver types because they only feel the permission to draft this position in the first round if they're able to get wide receiver production out of it in the passing game. Uh, they end up missing so often because these guys are extreme outliers. It's they barely exist. There's only a couple of them at a time, um, and I think that the development of the tight end position is making an extreme U-turn from where it was in the 2010s. I think with those guys, um, you could play them at the Y a lot because teams were just going to play cover three, or not regardless, but a lot of the time. And I think that with defenses, becoming with the honoring of the run becoming optional for defenses, whereas it used to be, job number one, we put this, up in our stop the run. It's what we do no matter what. Stop it first and then worry about everything else later. The shift in philosophy to limiting the damage from the passing game has completely changed the tight end position. Because if you put one of these deeper guys in your Y spot and have three true wide receivers on the field, you're functionally in 10 personnel. And there's a reason that people don't run 10 personnel in the NFL. It's because if the defense knows you're going to pass, the reality becomes extremely difficult. And I think if you look at just the data about productive offenses in the NFL, I think one of the only truly elite offenses in the NFL that did not run the ball at an elite level, or at least at a very high level last year, was Cincinnati, because they had, the nuclear button we talked about earlier. And again, that's an extreme outlier. Okay, you have Peyton Manning, Marvin Harrison, and Reggie Wayne. It's going to be hard not to have an elite offense. They break the rules, but the delineation of the Y and F roles and the emergence of at tight end and the emergence of blocking slots has made life extremely difficult for about 98% of these wide receiver type tight ends, because you can just put a Puka Nacua on the field, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, a Chris Godwin, and Drake London in your third receiver spot, and not lose anything from the passing game while also not losing a ton from the blocking. And there just becomes no point to most of these guys. So I think it's going to go hard in the other direction, which actually may create a lot of surplus value because these guys may get paid less because their receiving as a position is going to dip from where it was in the 2010s. Their value, however, is going to skyrocket. And if you can get a guy like a Kittle who can play at the Y and earn it and be treated like an extra tackle and treated, with those inner core box bodies, but also play like a receiver, that's when you're getting cheat code value. So I think the wide receiver type tight ends, outside of the select few, the Kelseys, the Bowers, who can truly play wide receiver without a drop off. And that's what I call the wide receiver test. If you can play wide receiver without a drop off, you get a hall pass for having to play in line. Everybody else, if you can't play in line serviceably, you are not going to be on the field a lot.
No, and I think that's actually a trend in the NFL now. It's kind of twofold. Is one, in some of these positions that used to be you only did one thing. If you could do another thing, that's great. Tight end has always kind of been a glorified tackle, and then you were an all-pro Hall of Fame guy if you could catch a pass, right? Running back, you have to be able to run the ball between the tackles. If you can go out and catch a pass and be prolific down the field and in the screen game, man, you're awesome. That's that added value, right? Linebacker, now we're seeing that, okay, you're an off ball. Great. Can you play edge? If you can, you're Frankie Louvu and you're an all pro, right? And it goes back to safety because now everybody's playing these two high positions. It used to be safety. You either were center field or you were the box.
Mm-hmm.
Now you got to be able to play both. And that value added is changing everything. This is to me, football is more and more becoming like basketball.
Mm-hmm.
This is a space sport. You have to be able to play in space at almost every level. Tackles have to be able to play in space. Guards have to now be able to play in space. So when you go to the tight end position, how are you doing player development? And like you said, these guys are unicorns. Like, I don't think people understand. Kittle is a one of one. Like, that guy is like, he blocks like a tackle, but then he also can catch passes just as good as most receivers. So how do we then function? This is where I think you hit on it. That 12 personnel alignment of where now we have a blocking tight end and we have a hybrid F, right? We have our Y and we have our F. We're going to draft both. And then that's why I think like the Raiders, for instance, are such a interesting dynamic because you have Bowers, who is this F, but he can also block. Then you have Meyer, who is a Y, but he's actually not bad at catching passes. So you have that dynamic. I think that offense it's going to be really, really exciting to watch. And so you go through, and we're starting to see too in team building, these building of tandems. I have a box, like I think the Commanders is a great example. I have a box linebacker in Wagner. I have a hybrid in Louvu. Look at that. They both were all pro last year, right? I need to have, the Panthers they're going to play too high shell every time, right? So where are we going to go? We got to go get a guy that can play. That's why they got the Morig kid from the Raiders, who was a down safety last year. The previous in 2023, he was a back, he was a deep safety. So you got to find, and to your point, you got to be able to play these two positions if you're going to be elite. And I think to your point, if you're going to get paid.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, that really is. And I think that, to your point about the tandems, I think especially in terms of the draft and any high capital allocation, whether it be free agency trades, and obviously high picks in the draft, I think we look at the tight end tandem as necessarily having to be a tight end and another tight end. It's really just a Y and an F. And I think like the Y has to be a tight end because there's no receivers who can dig out defensive ends. But the F doesn't. And so you have this different job description. I think that where we get trapped is we grade receiving only tight ends against the Ys, and then they're like, oh, these guys are great. And then they end up, on your depth chart and in practice, they end up competing with your power slots. And I think that we're going to see those guys block more and more. And I think that they changed so much about the wide receiver position. I think it changed slot receivers for a very long time. But like you said, like it's becoming like basketball in terms of space, and it's becoming like basketball in terms of positionlessness. And you need to be able to act your full offense at the same time and your full defense at the same time, because you can't on offense be given tells based on who's in the game, because defenses are too smart. They will. As somebody who watches tight end blocking very intently, I see so often how defenses will change their package based on which tight ends are in the game. You see it with the Ravens all the time. If Kohler or Ricard is out there, regardless of who the second guy is, teams will probably treat it like two tight end. If it like Andrews, they'll treat it like 10 personnel. It's
right.
It's nowhere is that clearer than when they played the Steelers. But like it's you've got to have these guys that you can do everything with, and that's why you build tandems. That you look at even on defense, you look back to linebackers with Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen. You have your plugger, you have your guy who can cover the space to bail him out. You just have to cover all your bases at once.
Yeah, absolutely. If that's all we've got, gentlemen, that'll do it for the Field Vision Football Podcast. Cody and Max, appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedules and jumping on. Follow us at Field Vision MI on X, at Field Vision Sports on Instagram. Max, I'll tag all your social medias in the description down below. But appreciate you once again.
Yeah, man, that was awesome. I will say before I hop off, being on a podcast with Cody Alexander just kind of feels like, as a scheme kid who once knew nothing and wanted to know everything, is like getting on the court and looking out there and there's LeBron. Like it's crazy. It's definitely not lost on me.
I appreciate you, Max. We've known each
like
other for a long time. It's fun to watch your career grow, man. I appreciate you and glad you could get on here with me.
I
can do it
compare
out
Cody
here.
a little more to Brian Scalabrine, but that's just me.
Oh, that's even better.